Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. We're here today with special guest, Sile Walsh, who's here to share with us her new Nautilus award-winning book, Inclusive Leadership: Navigating Organizational Complexity. So what if inclusion wasn't just about workplace policy, but a key to unlocking your team's best performance? Well, today's guest is here to share with us just that. Sile Walsh is a lecturer, facilitator, coach, researcher, and accredited professional supervisor who has worked internationally with over 20,000 leaders and organizations for over a decade. She's a PhD candidate researching inclusive leadership in the School of Psychology and has a professional background in coaching psychology and organizational development. So welcome to the show, Sile Walsh.
Thank you for having me, Marianne. I really appreciate it.
Oh my goodness. Well, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. And of course, congratulations on your Nautilus Book Award. What an accomplishment.
Oh, thank you. I'm really proud of it. Thank you.
Well, I found your book to be such a profound read. What inspired you to write this?
There's a few stories about what inspired me. I suppose the first one was that I'm in the middle of a PhD. I'm hoping to submit this Christmas. And in the middle of that, there was lots of things I was learning through working with organizations. And I was noticing that wasn't going to make it into the PhD, but was the real life examples that people were sharing with me and were repetitive things that were happening in organizations. So I didn't want to lose that information, and inclusive leadership is quite timely in the sense that in a year I might have to alter the whole book. And so I wanted to capture what wasn't making it into my PhD, but was really important based on the organizations I'm working with and the leaders I was working with, because they've put all this effort in, but it wasn't all being captured in my PhD. So I wanted to capture it somewhere where people could learn from each other, where we could share some kind of core concepts that are being overlooked in this space. So that's one. And the other thing that kind of gave me a little bit of a kick up the butt was that I accidentally, and anyone who does any research or does any work, I found two different people were misusing my work and were pretending it was their research. And I realized that because I didn't have it in the public domain, that it was really important that I acknowledged it, because it's not just about it not being acknowledged as my own work, but more importantly, the work of the people I've worked with and their effort and their trust in me and their sharing. And so I just wanted to kind of capture it as a really important lesson. And I didn't want to waste the insight and the experience that the people I'd worked with had that helped inform the book. So they were the kind of two things that got me to promptly do it, rather than just saying I would do it in the future one day.
Well, I'm so glad you did. And I'm sorry to hear about people taking credit for your work, because that's something that I know happens a lot. But what's interesting, ethics always wins out. So having this information in your book, and I know you work with some of the top companies in Europe and worldwide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the interesting thing is, we all, like, I believe, on the shoulders of giants, we all stand. And so I wouldn't be where I was if it wasn't for lots of other people doing lots of other great work and sharing it in some way. And I just think that sometimes, I could talk about the work not being misrepresented, but the issue is that that's the real experience lots of people have. It's also something that we know happens to people who are traditionally oppressed or marginalized. So I just think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes you're doing your best and you think, oh, one day I'll do this, but without actually considering that ethical piece. And am I just allowing my work to be undervalued by not placing it where it needs to be and giving people access to it? So it's quite an important kind of living lesson that got the book written, to be fair.
So in your book, you discuss inclusive leadership in a way that differs from other books I've read.
Mhm.
Can you explain that to us so we can get an understanding?
Yeah, so I purposely wanted to define it really clearly, because there is a difference between societal inclusion, which I believe everybody within a society belongs where they are. And we can get into lots of political discussions about that. But in a workplace, we exist in a workplace to add value to the purpose of the work. So the reason the organization exists. If it's a for-profit, it's to produce profit. If it's a not-for-profit, it's to have an impact. If it's, education, it's to educate. And one of the things I found with the definition of inclusive leadership was it kept leaning on the word inclusion rather than inclusive leadership as the actual term. And so very simply, I define inclusive leadership as the practice, as inclusion practices in leadership roles, and that leadership can be more than just a positional role. It can be a position, a title, which most of us are familiar with. You might be a thought leader, so somebody who's influencing others by them trusting what you think, maybe because you're an expert, or maybe just because they think you are smart and think about things well. And then there's also the people who are social leaders, who often say that they're not or don't consider themselves leaders, but socially have quite a big influence on others. People trust them, people go to them for advice, people run ideas past them. And so inclusive leadership is the use of inclusion in leadership practices, whether it's that you're a formal or informal leader. And by looking at it this way, everybody can ask themselves how they're leading within their organization, as opposed to whether they have the title of leader, because inclusive leadership is a shared leadership practice. It's not just simply somebody with a title. So it's also an invitation, I think, is what's a bit different about my definition. You can inclusion is an invitation. You can invite people to be involved and be included, but you cannot force them. You cannot mandate it. And so inclusive leadership is much more about how we work with people, utilize inclusion to produce the outcomes that we're expected to produce at work, whether we're that formal leader with a position and a leadership title, or informal leaders who are thought leaders or are social leaders. And so I broadened it because I found that when working in organizations, the reality is that leadership happens in every moment when we influence people or don't. It happens when you're having coffee or you're grabbing a water. It happens when you're in a meeting. It doesn't just happen when somebody with the official title is in the room.
So, what are some of the most common misconceptions about inclusion in organizations?
So there's loads. Sometimes the main focus is that people think that inclusion is either for me or for them. So inclusion in a workplace is for everybody in the workplace so that they can achieve their task at work. And that includes everyone, regardless of your identity. A lot of the times, politically, people focus on inclusion politically from the point of view of those who are marginalized and oppressed. And while that is also true in the workplace, the purpose of inclusion in the workplace is to help people perform at work and be well and to have an impact in their workplace. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions is either somebody thinks inclusion is for me or someone thinks inclusion is for them. But actually, inclusion is for everyone within the workplace, and everybody has a responsibility to facilitate inclusion as well as to decide whether they accept the invitation or not. And the other thing I think that can really pull people aside is thinking that inclusive leadership is more about including people than leading. And the reality is that if you are not leading in your role and you're attempting to be an inclusive leader, you won't be leading in your role for long. And so inclusive leadership has to be about performing your role as a leader and as an employee and a member of the organization. It's not simply about being nice to people or, using terminology that's quite popular at the moment. It's much more about the impact of, are you enabling people to perform by considering how inclusion might make it easier for them to perform and add value to the organization. And I suppose the biggest one, and it's quite in the political sphere quite strongly, is this idea that inclusive efforts or inclusive leadership is about giving people an easier time or about lowering standards. But there's lots of research that would point the opposite direction. If we broadened how we were measuring people and therefore got more of a breadth of performance, and we didn't just measure individual contributions as performance, you'd actually find that we would have more diverse populations within organizations, because when you broaden the criteria of performance, you'll find that lots of individuals who are only being measured in one way actually can perform in a number of ways. And so I think that that's probably a really important point, that you can actually increase the quality of performance and the standard of the people you hire by considering inclusion in terms of performance within organizational life. It's not about lowering standards. In fact, I often argue it's about increasing standards, and then therefore you get better candidates, and it tends to naturally become more diverse then.
It sounds completely different than what I think most people think about inclusion in the workplace and what we've been taught, or maybe think that that's what it should be. And I really like how you've approached it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the reason that it's different is a couple of things, if I'm really honest. Coming from Ireland and an Irish culture, and having travelled and worked quite a bit in with different countries and different cultures, it's become really apparent to me that one of the reasons that we perceive certain ideas of performance in a very individualistic way is because often we only measure certain things. And then this idea of diversifying can lead people to believe that we're lowering standards. But in fact, if we just take very basically, if you take any member of a marginalized population or an oppressed group, and you consider all the additional work that they have to do to be in the workplace, but none of that is being measured necessarily in performance reviews. But actually, there's a lot of invisible labor that people from marginalized populations engage in. And if you remove that from the workplace, we will have workplaces that aren't very cohesive, aren't very aligned, don't come up with more optimal solutions, replicate the status quo, create groupthink, and I could go on and on. And so I suppose what I was seeing in reality was that when you diversify groups and you actually leverage them effectively through inclusive leadership practices, you actually get better outcomes, but also individuals, if we measure them differently, broaden the measure. I'm not talking about stopping the individual measurement. I'm talking about broadening it to consider things that are often done by marginalized populations that keep organizations together, such as there's a lot of emotional invisible labor that is done in workplaces by certain groups more than other groups. And if that became part of our criteria for hiring and for promotion as well as performance, you would find different people would be superseding the performance reviews than maybe traditionally do. And so for me, when we go to work, we all go to work to add value to the workplace, and we go to work hopefully to enjoy our work, feel good about the work that we do, and add value to the workplace. And so inclusive leadership leans on that and leverages that idea that everybody wants to perform, and it thinks more broadly than an individualistic lens to think about the atmosphere, culture, climate in the workplace, and what actually leverages performance and supports performance, rather than simply confining performance to a limited amount of kind of bullet points, and then knowing that certain groups within the population will just focus on those, and they might do really well within those, but they may not be good in a team. They might not help with team performance. They might not do some of the invisible labor that has to happen in work groups for higher group performance, not just individually. And so to me, it just makes sense that we think more broadly about it, and we look at it through the lens of a leadership approach, as opposed to what tends to happen is we tend to lean on it as an inclusion activity. Now, of course, it utilizes inclusion, and there is an element of that in there, but in the service of leadership, as opposed to in the service of inclusion. It's utilizing inclusion to serve effective performance and leadership at every level in an organization.
Can you share a real life story from the book that illustrates inclusion in action?
It's a really good question. There's kind of a number of stories. I suppose I have a common example that happens quite frequently across different types of organizations. So I might give that example because it doesn't disclose any, confidential information or anything that any company would be able to see themselves in. But frequently, I have to say, traditionally, over the last 14 years, I've worked in leadership spaces. I've always leveraged inclusive leadership in those spaces, but traditionally I was hired just to work with senior teams and aspiring leaders. And that's still the case today. One of the things I've seen that really does demonstrate the value of inclusive leadership in workplaces and to the workforce and to the workplace itself is traditional leadership often makes decisions and then follows through on them. And whenever there's resistance, it can often perceive resistance as a rejection of the decision. When you utilize inclusive leadership, as a number of the case studies that I share discussed, what ends up happening is you utilize resistance as relevant data and information. And a number of organizations I've worked with were in really difficult places with unions or really difficult places with employee engagement and morale. And through very small tweaks where the leaders engage in inclusive leadership practices, so asking questions instead of directing people, asking for input and actually listening, considering the input that was given, considering the different points of view and why there might be tension for employees to carry out certain activities. What they ended up doing was being able to reduce very big workplace conflicts into agreements between the leadership team and the employees involved without there needing to be any big legal ramifications, any big PR ramifications. And that was simply that the approach that the leadership teams I've worked with took that engaged in more collaborative styles of discussions rather than defensive or directive. And that's just one of the principles in inclusive leadership is I can't lead inclusively without others. We have to actually collaborate for inclusion to occur. So that's one example. Another example that also happens frequently with inclusive leadership is that when you're utilizing inclusive leadership, instead of assuming because of someone's identity that they're having a certain experience or they need a certain reasonable accommodation or they require a certain something, you end up actually asking the people that it affects the question. And then you get a more direct answer. So for instance, I worked with one organization and I won't even talk about how much they spent on putting in physical changes to the building so that it was more accessible for people with physical accessibility needs. Now, this sounds really good. And generally, I would say that's a brilliant move, except they said it didn't help staff morale. Nobody's feeling it's more inclusive. And they went on to say it's not working. When we went in and reviewed what they did, we found that actually the leadership team made a decision to put a lot of money into building changes without consulting the actual employees about what the barriers to inclusion they're facing are. And one of the barriers they were facing was actually not about physical access at this point. The current employees, they were facing some very basic barriers around the shift times, the language being used in the workplace, and cultural differences. And so the company, trying to be really progressive, made what would traditionally be seen as a good inclusion decision, but actually they met the needs of somebody who didn't exist in the company at this point in time. Now, they were trying to attract people with physical accessibility needs, so that's helpful. But in doing so, they created resentment with their current employees. And so one of the kind of key practices that makes the world of difference is ensuring that the changes you're making are practical. And one of the pieces that I do with a lot of leaders who are looking at being more inclusive is just teaching them to work with asking the right questions to the right people so that you have the right data to inform the decision, rather than putting all this energy into what you think will have an impact and not actually solving a real problem that exists there. And so a big thing that happens in organizations is this: it's trying to do the right thing without assessing the needs that are at play. And so I found that those two situations that I've just mentioned have happened across so many organizations that it is a trend for those two challenges to occur. One is directing people and not really finding solutions with them, and then employees kind of sitting there observing and watching the leadership team, judging them, waiting for them to make mistakes and not really kind of working together to solve anything. And then the second one is decisions being made from a perspective, a point of view, positive intention, but no real data to back it up that it's meeting a real need of your current and future employees. And so those two things happen repeatedly across organizations.
What would inclusive leadership look like in your daily meetings, decision making, or even performance reviews?
I love that question. So performance reviews, first of all, you would take into account multiple different types of performance. So you wouldn't just take in the kind of standard KPIs. You'd also say, how did you help your team perform? You'd also ask, how did you help people within the organization achieve their goals, so that people are thinking about themselves as part of an organization and not just an individual contributor. You'd ask, what do you need to be able to improve your performance? That's an inclusive question. You don't have to ask people about their identities, or you don't have to ask for a big list of identity-based information, because the truth is, what people need is what you need to know to be inclusive. So for performance reviews, we should keep the standard KPIs, focus on some collective supports. How did you help the organization perform? How did you help your colleagues perform? And then in terms of making sure that your individual employees are communicating their needs to you, ask that question. What are your needs? What could help you perform better in this next quarter? So it's not about having a load of boxes to tick or knowing everything about every identity group, because that is just not possible, right? There's always more to learn, but what we can do is focus on the needs people have so that they can perform at work. And those needs will often relate to their differences, or relate to protected characteristics, relate to different things. But if we simply ask, what do you need? We're so much closer to supporting our employees being included than if we're simply just measuring whether they met their KPIs or not. Because an employee who's facing marginalization, and exclusion might meet the same KPIs, but the effort they've had to use to do that might be far more than a colleague who isn't. And so then that's not equitable or a fair playing ground, because they're both achieving the same thing, but what they are doing to achieve it is different levels of effort. So if we get focused on needs, that would be more effective. In terms of just leadership meetings, day-to-day stuff, ironically, it's quite simple. It's repeating the needs question. What do we need to improve things here? It's asking questions at meetings like, whose point of view might we not be considering right now? It might be about assessing if you have the right people in the room, or you've just got the people who want to be in the room. They're two different things. If we're making decisions about any group within an organization, it's often important to have some representation from that group, so that you are getting an understanding of how they're experiencing the challenges. The irony of this is the things I'm suggesting to you are in lots of different management theories, but they don't link them to inclusion. They just keep them kind of tucked up in performance. But the reality is, inclusion is an invitation and understanding between people. And in the workplace, inclusive leadership is using that invitation and understanding to produce an outcome. So in a meeting, it can be as simple as I've just said. Ask, whose point of view aren't we considering? Who isn't in the room that needs to be in the room? Could these meetings be more effective? Is this the most effective way to run these meetings? Is there any points of view nobody shared that would help us think about this more broadly? What population might we be ignoring, forgetting, not considering? And then it can also be things like, with your direct team, having a work with me document where people explain how to work best with them. It can be asking people, what do we need to perform? It can be taking graciously feedback if we've used terminology or said something that someone has experienced as offensive, rather than becoming defensive. There's a model in my book called FAR, which is about learning to actually receive what they're saying well. Now, that doesn't mean you have to agree with them, because this is often where people get caught. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but there is an effective way to receive it, process it, and repair if required, rather than what we tend to do, which is, reject it or be horrified, or dismiss it because it makes us uncomfortable. And then the other thing, I think, for inclusive leaders, or people trying to be inclusive leaders, is knowing that to be an inclusive leader is to be in a relationship that is ever growing. It's not a set way of being. It isn't a set of behaviors. My PhD argues this. It isn't, if you do this, you are an inclusive leader. It's relevant to the context, whether you're supporting the delivery of the task at hand, and if you're doing it in a way that optimizes the performance of the people that you're leading. And I think that if we can understand that it's not about perfect, it's just about making progress and helping our teams and individuals in our team support them to perform, then we're much further along than learning something about every identity group and every terminology. And maybe the other one I will say, for anyone working in global companies, there isn't one set truth for a lot of this stuff. And I think this is really important when it comes to diversity and identity and the language around microaggressions and things like that. They are culturally informed. And so when we're working globally, regardless of where you're based and your experience of something is, it will be understood and experienced based on somebody else's cultural experience. And so sometimes what I found in global companies is there's a base in one geographical location that kind of dominates what's normed across the organization, but then there can be unnecessary offenses being taken because people are applying their cultural understanding of diversity and differences and marginalization to somebody else's cultural experience, and therefore making a decision that the other company or the other person is intentionally being harmful. When we work across the globe, we have to understand that there isn't one set norm. And I think inclusive leaders at senior global levels have to take that into account in order to be inclusive, because if they don't take that into account, they're simply dominating their organization with one worldview, which in and of itself is not inclusive.
So, in your book, you link inclusive leadership to performance, and something we've kind of touched on a little bit, much more strongly than others. So, why is that?
So this is really important. So some people say argue the business case or don't. Some people say it's a moral case. Some people say, it should be in every business. Other people say it should be out in society, not in businesses. I do it for a very, very basic reason. One is I've seen the impact it has on performance. So to me, it's really obvious because I'm a pracademic, I'm not an academic. I come from practice. I've worked with lots of organizations and leaders and leadership teams, and understanding how to use inclusive leadership helps them in their individual performance as leaders, but also their teams. So that's one reason. The other reason is my background is coaching psychology. So I think about people in workplaces through a performance lens. But there is this kind of more underlying piece, which is, and we'll have seen it in recent times, with different positions very big public figures have taken. If it isn't weaved into your business, it won't exist after it's topical. It will be dismissed or devalued or demoted depending on resources, priorities, and laws. Whereas when you look at it through a performance lens, it would make no sense that an organization would be told by anyone that it is illegal to help your team perform. Every organization produces an outcome, usually around money if it's a for-profit, through their people. And so the link between producing the outcome that creates more money and their people is how those people perform with the processes. And so performance is a fundamental part of organizational life. And so for me, inclusive leadership's linked to performance is the most important way to ensure that it's weaved into the DNA of an organization, and it's not pulled apart for political gain. Instead, it's actually part of the DNA of how the organization performs, because that is the bridge, we'll say, between people going to work and having a job, is that they perform, add value to the organization produces its outcome, a profit, education, depending on what it is, and therefore people are retained within their jobs. Also, ultimately, the majority of people go to work and they want to have a positive experience. And when people perform well, they usually feel good about themselves. And so it's also a way to consider the person and their experience of work, as well as the value that they bring to work. So to me, it's performance is in the DNA of organizational life. And I could go lots of other angles on it, politically, socially. I could argue the business case, but ultimately, the thing that kind of links people to workplaces is how they perform their work, and then how that has an impact for the shareholders or for the organizational purpose. So I went right back to the DNA of it. And I suppose that's also what I'm hired for. So that might be part of my positionality. I'm hired to help organizations perform, whether it's through individuals or teams or the senior leadership team. And so that's how I do my work with organizations. And it just seems like the most foundational link to me.
Can you describe a moment that significantly changed your thinking on inclusive leadership?
Yes. Yes. So I belong to lots of marginalized populations, right? So I have lots of labels, and we could throw those labels around. But what was really interesting for me, and this has happened a few times in my career, but was when I was working with someone that was I really really liked, and I'm a queer person, and when I was working with them, I found out that they were homophobic, like very strongly homophobic. Now, my work is confidential, and I work with people with lots of oppositional views to me, because it's not about my view dominating theirs, it's about me helping them perform. And what was really interesting to me about that experience was, historically and in a lot of marginalized communities, we learn to reject the other. So the person rejecting us, we learn to reject, or we use kind of derogatory terms to describe them. Um, Almost as a reaction to what we're experiencing in terms of being rejected. And when I was working with this person, my work is about being, having unconditional positive regard for the person, focusing on what they're asking me to help them with. But also in that moment, I realized that they came to their homophobic beliefs in a journey that they had very little control over. And quite similar to my own journey that led me to being very LGBTQ plus inclusive, I had very little control over lots of parts of that journey that led me to being inclusive. And I realized that most people become who they are based on their experiences and the surrounding influences. And we don't always have control over that. And so I obviously do not promote hate speech or hate crime or any overt actions. And I would love everyone to be far more inclusive. But in that moment, I realized that people who align with me politically were perpetrating, and I was perpetrating the exact same othering that we were trying to correct. And I realized that as a person trying to do inclusive leadership or any work with people, I have as much responsibility to manage my own biases, my own othering, my own rejection of differences, because it's all very well saying let's be inclusive, but what we mean is let's be inclusive of people like us. We don't mean let's be inclusive of people different to us. And in workplaces, we are going to work with people who are different to us. Now, that doesn't mean that I condone discrimination or any discriminatory acts. But actually, I also have to find a place where I can work with people with different beliefs to me. And I think that changed my whole understanding of inclusion and inclusive leadership, because in that moment, I realized that when I go to work, it just kind of rang true in a very different way. When I go to work, I'm going to work in order to produce an outcome with these people. And we won't all politically agree, and we won't all have similar experiences. But if I believe that inclusive leadership and inclusion results in better outcomes, then I need to find a way to include people with different beliefs to me and ensure that there are ways to work together that are effective and helpful. And so that was a real kind of distinctive moment, which moved me from inclusion, everyone should be nice to each other, which I still believe, but it's more complex than that, to realizing that I was as much part of the problem, because in society I can choose not to spend time with people or hang out with people or listen to people. But in workplaces, hopefully, depending on what countries people are in, Ireland and the EU has some really good discrimination legislation. But my job is to work with people who are different to me. And if I'll only engage with people who agree with me, then I'm replicating the very problem that I'm talking about resolving in the workplace. But just to be clear, I'm not talking about working with people who are actively discriminatory towards me in their behavior and how they speak to me. I'm talking about working with people who behave appropriately. We have ways of working together, but we might not agree politically or have shared values or beliefs. But it's our job in the workplace to find a way to work together that is respectful without attempting to dominate each other with our belief systems.
Well, Sheila, where can our listeners go to connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about inclusive leadership?
So you can find my book on Amazon. You can also go to my website, which is shilawalsh.com or ellis-advantage.com. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's probably where I post most frequently, or with my weekly newsletter, which is the leadership letters.
Sheila, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Make sure to connect with Sheila at her website, silewalsh.com, for more information on her book, Inclusive Leadership, and also to be part of her community. Inclusive Leadership is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Mary Ann, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Mary Ann is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Mary Ann will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmaryann.com for more information.